the History Channel original podcast.
History This Week is now in its 6th season, which is kind of crazy, but we're continuing to grow and to bring you stories from the past that you've never heard before. There are more ways than ever to follow our show. So yes, you can listen on your podcast app, but now you can also subscribe to History This Week Plus on Apple Podcasts for an ad-free experience on all new episodes. Also, if you're more of a Spotify person, Spotify now lets you comment directly on individual episodes. So let us know what you think. You can also get email reminders each time an episode comes out. Sign up for that at historythisweekpodcast.com. And be sure to follow us on our new Instagram page too. There's some fun stuff going on over there. As always, share History This Week with your friends. Give us a 5-star review if you want. And if you want to reach out, shoot us an email at historythisweek@history.com. 5 years in, we have a ton of episodes that you can always go back and listen to, and we're also really excited about everything that's coming up. We hope you are too. For now, enjoy the latest episode. History This Week, July 17th, 1674. I'm Sally Helm. A group of laborers is digging in the shadow of the White Tower, a famous white-bricked castle keep. If you close your eyes and picture a generic castle, you're probably imagining it just right. The White Tower is part of the Tower of London, which is basically a small citadel on the banks of the River Thames. Over the years, it's had many royal uses. And today, these laborers are doing some renovations. According to the story, they're digging beneath a staircase, 10 feet under the ground, when they find something unexpected. 2 small skeletons. Children, long dead. News of the discovery reaches King Charles II, and he thinks, I know exactly who those children are. Nearly 200 years earlier, in 1483, 2 young boys famously disappeared from the Tower of London. 12-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother. They arrived at the castle by June, and by autumn, they'd vanished. Over time, rumors spread that they'd been murdered. And not just that. The suspicion was they'd been killed by their uncle, the king, Richard III, later made famous as a Shakespearean madman. And now, here are 2 tiny skeletons, which seem to confirm his savagery. King Charles II has the bones sealed into a marble urn and interred in Westminster Abbey. But royal bones don't always stay buried. Centuries later, in 2012, a writer named Philippa Langley comes forward with a discovery. She thinks she knows the true location of a different body, the body of the boy's uncle, the infamous Richard III. Langley has been working for years on a project, the Looking for Richard project. Like basically everyone else, she'd initially thought of him as the Shakespearean villain. But then one day, she's on a vacation in Cyprus when she reads a book that changes her mind.
It was by an American academic called Paul Murray Kendall. And what Kendall did was he went back to the contemporary sources and records from Richard's own lifetime. And he spoke about this really interesting individual, but one that you could see from all of the materials was considered to be loyal, brave, devout, and just.
Really different from the sort of villainous Shakespearean character.
Yeah, so I couldn't understand why whenever we hear about Richard III, it's the Shakespearean villain who was rolled out. Because when you've got people talking about him in private letters and diaries and basically talking about his good reputation, I think you have to take those very seriously.
She did, and started to put the pieces together. Richard had political enemies, most significantly the future King Henry Tudor, who will become Henry VII. And it looks to Langley like those enemies buried these positive accounts of Richard and instead painted him as a villain. And then their version of Richard just got repeated over and over. Shakespeare picked it up, and people started thinking of it as fact. So she's found this other Richard in the archives, but she also wants to find him more literally. His burial place has never been found. And when Langley goes looking for Richard's remains, she encounters a lot of stories, like that his coffin became a horse trough, or his bones were tossed into a river. But she ignores the rumors and takes a forensic approach, focusing on hard facts. She zeroes in on a particular place where she thinks Richard can be found, a parking lot in Leicester, England. She hires archaeologists to look there, and sure enough, they find a body.
The archaeologists weren't particularly interested in them. They thought they were too far west and were probably the remains of a friar.
But later analysis confirms, with almost 100% accuracy, it's not a friar. This is the body of King Richard III.
To find him in the exact place that my research said he would be, and also an intuition said he would be, which actually started my search for Richard, it was completely overwhelming. It really was.
This whole experience teaches Philippa Langley something powerful. It's possible to solve very old historical mysteries by taking a fresh, clear-eyed look at the facts. And it's not long before she turns her attention to a different mystery: the disappearance of Richard's nephews, the princes in the tower.
I decided to get in touch with investigative specialists, with the police, with lawyers, with advocates and barristers. And they all said the same thing. They said, look, this is a missing persons investigation. There's no identified bodies. You have to start with a blank page. You have to drop everything and begin at the beginning again.
Today, a conversation with Philippa Langley, author of The Princes in the Tower, Solving History's Greatest Cold Case. Based on her research, what does Langley think really happened to the princes? Did the prime suspect, their uncle Richard III, actually kill them? Philippa Langley, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
So let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin with the princes. What do we know about what they were like?
In terms of the elder prince, he seems to have been quite a studious young man, quite an intelligent young man, very capable. We have a contemporary source that says facially he looked like Edward IV. He looked like his father.
Mm-hmm. And his name was in fact Edward. He was Edward V.
He was an Edward. He was Edward V. He was the heir to the throne. Every moment of every day he was told what he would be doing, whether it's praying, whether it was eating, whether it was studying, whether it was doing physical exercise. And you can see that he's beginning to become a proper teenager. He's beginning to push boundaries and to push against the world that he was living in.
How about his younger brother, Richard? What do we know about him?
Yeah, it's really interesting because his younger brother seems to have been completely different. And all the accounts tell us that he was very active, very physical, and seemed to have been good at sports and liked dancing, liked music, and seemed to have been completely full of life. So the sense you get is that you've got a more quiet, studious older brother who was beginning to push against boundaries, trying to find himself and who he was. And then you've got this whirlwind of energy who was his little brother, who probably never shut up.
So just sort of expanding our view to the rest of their family, their father, Edward IV, was king, and they also have a famous uncle who is Richard III. So what was their relationship with Richard like?
From what we can see, I mean, Richard then was Duke of Gloucester, and he was the younger brother, as you say, of Edward IV, incredibly loyal to Edward IV. He was his leading supporter and also had most of the important jobs in the realm. So he was a very capable man. And we only have small snatches of conversations that have been recorded between Richard as Duke of Gloucester and both princes. And in all instances, Richard is very respectful and is basically following the format of the day for a Prince of Wales and for the royal family.
So the prince's upbringing is relatively normal, but then their father, the king, suddenly dies in April of 1483. Do we know what happened? How did he die?
We don't. We're told that he got some kind of chill when he was out apparently fishing. But of course, this, nobody expected Edward IV to die. It came as a huge surprise.
Yeah, so his sons are young. Edward is 12 and his younger brother is 9.
Yeah.
And is it the case that Edward IV expected and planned for his 12-year-old son to take the throne upon his death?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that would be normal and that would be fully expected because he was the eldest boy. So he was definitely the heir and the Prince of Wales.
What role did Edward IV imagine or lay out for his brother, Richard III?
Well, this is another interesting thing because when Edward was dying, he made a number of codicils to his will. And one of these was that he wanted his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who lived in the north of England, so quite far away from London, and he wanted him to become the protector of the realm, to become the Lord Protector, because Edward V, his eldest son, was only 12. So you can see that he's putting his brother in charge of the realm in order so that it's secure for his son.
Right, which makes some sense given that his son is so young. That sort of is expected. So after the king's death, Richard brings his nephew to London for the coronation. And along the way, as far as I understand it, he arrests and executes some relatives of his nephew's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. I know that some historians see that as sort of evidence of his growing thirst for power. How do you see it? What do you think is going on in that incident?
Yeah, again, that's the traditional account, that this was Richard always gunning for the throne, and this is the proof of it. But I think if you dig deeper, the historians that have sort of gone with that account, if you like, they always ignored the fact that Richard was the Constable of England. So this meant he was in charge of homeland security. And what you can see is that the accounts that we have were telling us that there was some kind of plot. And this is why Richard then arrests these individuals and he sent them north, and they remained in custody for 6 to 8 weeks. So he didn't execute them immediately when he actually could have, because he was the Constable of England. So he had the power to do that, and he could have executed them at Northampton. So you can see that he's trying to negotiate a minefield at this time.
And just to put a bit of a finer point on it, the plot that the Woodvilles would have had to gain power, how would that have gone? Like, what were they hoping would happen?
His coronation had been arranged very hastily and very quickly so that Edward V would be crowned with no parliament. Well, if they had crowned Edward V on the 4th of May, without Richard, Duke of Gloucester, being there, then he would not have been able to have become the Lord Protector of Edward V. So that means Edward V could have reigned as king from day one, the moment that he was crowned. So a 12-year-old boy would have become king. But the thing with Edward V was he was very close to Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. So by default, it would have been Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who would have been ruling the country through Edward V.
So it seems like there is some power wrangling going on between Richard and the Woodvilles. So that's along the way to the coronation. In May of 1483, Richard III places his nephew, Edward V, in the Tower of London and also sends for the prince's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, to also stay at the Tower. Tell me about that, because I think today we usually think of the Tower of London as a prison, essentially. But is that what it would have been at the time? Like, what does it mean that he sends them to the Tower?
No, the Palace of the Tower of London was exactly that. It was the main royal palace for London. And it held the royal apartments, the royal mint, the treasury, the garrison, the armory. And it also had 15 pubs. So it was like a small city. It was full of people. And we can estimate there was probably about 1,000 people living and working there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was really, really busy. And it wasn't Richard that determined that Edward V should go to the Palace of the Tower of London. And it was actually the Duke of Buckingham who said that Edward V should go to the Tower of London because where he was too small for him and all of his attendants. So Buckingham suggested at the King's Council, well, why not send him to the Palace of the Tower of London? Because he has to leave there for coronation anyway. And so everyone agreed. Because this is where kings always left for their coronation from the Tower of London. And they then applied to Elizabeth Woodville, who was in sanctuary at Westminster at the time, and said, look, his younger brother needs to be with his older brother because he's about to be crowned. And so can you release him and let him go to the palace with his brother? And so that's how the two princes then ended up in the Tower, the Palace of the Tower of London, 5 days before Edward V was due to be crowned.
Okay, and then a complication emerges. A sort of succession problem is brought to light by a bishop. Tell me about what happens there.
Yeah, it looks like from everything that we can see from the contemporary sources is that the act of getting Richard, Duke of York, and sending him to the Tower Palace to ready both princes for coronation seems to have been the catalyst for this bishop coming forward. And he came forward with what was bombshell information, and which basically caused a constitutional crisis.
When we return, a long-kept secret threatens to disrupt the line of succession. Richard III has to make a choice: a quiet life in the north or the crown. How did this decision earn him a reputation as a cold-blooded killer? June 1483. Just before Edward V is due to be crowned king, an English bishop has come forward saying that he has information that's going to disrupt the line of succession.
He told the King's Council that Edward IV had been married to another woman when he married Elizabeth Woodville, so the mother of the children of Edward IV, the princes in the Tower. So basically, Edward IV had committed bigamy, and his children were now declared illegitimate.
Yeah, so it's an interesting moment. It's going to be a good moment for Richard, the dead king's brother. So I guess this must be one of the moments where people who want to see this as sort of Richard's power grab, where they drill down, right? I can see how they might say, where did this bishop get this information? Why does he bring it forward now? Is this some kind of conspiracy? Like, is that how people tell this moment of the story?
Yes, I think in most of the traditional accounts they do. But you know what? I would definitely question this is a great moment for Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Again, from what we can see from the contemporary sources, it wasn't. Because he's petitioned to become king by the 3 estates of the realm, and it takes him 24 hours to accept. And you can kind of understand that. He was really happy in the north. He'd made the north his own. And his homes were there, his wife were there, his children was there. This would change his life completely. So he doesn't respond immediately.
He hesitates.
But
he does become king. He's crowned.
He does.
And how do people react to his coronation? What's the feeling around it?
Do you know, the feeling is, you can see it's really good. It's accepted by the people generally, and his coronation is one of the best attended coronations. Everybody seems to be saying, yes, this is the right thing to do. So he is the king.
All right. Now we are coming up to the big mystery at the center of this project that you've been engaged in. Because soon after the coronation, that summer, the two princes seem to disappear. Is there panic? Do people think they've been murdered?
No, not at all. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence whatsoever that people had thought that the princes had been murdered during Richard's reign.
Richard III has become the prime suspect in this incident over time, and you pinpoint a moment where the idea that he murdered the princes arises at this particular key political juncture where someone else is trying to essentially take the throne from him. Richard III's reign it's relatively short. It's only about 2 years. Tell me about how it ended.
Yeah, so you're right. It was a very short reign because Richard's reign ended at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485. And this is when England was invaded by a pretender who was backed by France. And he had a very, very tenuous claim to the throne, and his name was Henry Tudor. And he went on to become Henry VII. And I think at the time, at the Battle of Bosworth, he was about 30th in line to the throne. But he was backed by France, and he had mercenaries from France. And having won that battle, he was then proclaimed king on that battlefield by his supporters. And I think one of the big things that we discovered was that the entry point of the murder story into England arrived with Henry Tudor, and we can actually date it to the 14th of August, 1485. And this is when Henry was telling people that Richard murdered the princes in the Tower.
Interesting. So one of the first things you do is actually, it's not about finding the princes, it's about kind of the forensics of the story.
Yeah, the first two major lines of investigation that the project undertook was, the first one was we had to analyse all of the contemporary records and documents and sources that we have for the reign of Richard III. Because if the princes went missing during the reign of Richard III, this is where we're going to find where they were and evidence, potential evidence of how they died and where they were murdered. But the second line of investigation that we then had to undertake was the Battle of Bosworth. And we had to do a forensic analysis of everything that was happening around then, because this is when the worlds of Richard III and Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, collided head on. And we knew that Henry Tudor was the mortal enemy of Richard III. So these two lines of investigation took nearly 4 years just to do them.
So I know your project involves going through the evidence. Let's do that. What are the key clues that you uncover in terms of what really happened to the princes?
So yes, after we'd undertaken these two lines of investigation, we had to start taking the potential survival of both princes seriously, because we could see no evidence anywhere for the death of either prince. But what we could see is when they're mentioned in contemporary documents and records, they're always talked about in the present tense. And there's no pious prayers or observances for their souls. So we then had to expand the investigation, and we had to expand it into the reign of Henry VII.
Up next, Philippa Langley's team of researchers uncovers evidence of clandestine escapes, military invasions, and tragic endings. Stay tuned. Philippa Langley's initiative was called the Missing Princes Project. And she wasn't doing this project alone.
By this time, we had over 300 members around the world searching archives everywhere. And I think this is when having so many members becomes really important. And this is when we started to make the most remarkable discoveries, because we could see two things happening. We could see the destruction of documents that was taking place by Henry VII and his government in the reign of Richard III. But then having this massive research project, we could then open the investigation into Europe. And this is where Henry's reach, couldn't get to, if you like. And this is when we started finding the proof of life.
The proof of life, what was it? What did you find?
So I think the first main one that we found was in May 2020, and this was by Albert Janderoy, who is a researcher in Holland. And he found in the Lille archives in northern France a receipt for weapons. And the receipt is dated the 16th of December, 1487, when Edward IV's eldest son, Edward V, would have been 17. And the weapons are for an invasion of England by the son of Edward IV. And it says who had been expelled from his dominion. He'd been sent to the Channel Islands and put into exile. And we knew this from 2 contemporary sources.
Wow. Okay. So you're putting the story together. You've had accounts that Edward V was not killed, but rather sent away to the Channel Islands, sent to exile. And then you find, like a literal receipt of his existence. He bought a weapon. Yeah, it sounds like that felt pretty definitive, that he was at least alive when he was 17.
Yeah. So to find it stating that these weapons were for the son of King Edward IV was huge. It was a really big moment. And I think what the police told me, it was one of the things that they said we have to do, is they said you have to look in administrative records. They're the places to find truth because they were not written for public consumption and they had no reason to lie.
So that's sort of a trace of the older brother, the sort of quieter one, Edward V. How about the young, rambunctious Richard? What do we know of what happened to him?
Yeah, again, I think 2020 was a big year for the Missing Princes project because there's another remarkable researcher in Holland called Natalie Neyman Bleekendal. And Natalie discovered a document in Arnhem in Holland in the Gelderland archive. I described it as mind-blowing, and it really is, because it's a 4-page semi-legal manuscript written by the younger prince in the first person, I, Richard, and it tells his 10-year story from being in London in 1483 and being at the palace with his brother, and then being taken out of the palace by John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and 2 guardians called Thomas and Henry Percy, and being taken to the continent, where he was then kept in safekeeping. So this gave us a huge moment in terms of what was happening to the younger prince.
Lay it out for me. It sounds like you have a sense now of what you think really happened to them after they left the tower. What is it? If they weren't murdered, where did they go? What were their lives like from there?
Yeah, well, what we can see at the moment is that the elder boy was removed from the tower and in the summer of 1483, and he was taken to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. And I think after that, Edward V, before the Battle of Bosworth, was then sent to the Channel Islands, where he again was kept in close custody, because of course he could have been used to foment rebellion against Richard III. And we are then told that he was set free in Guernsey after the Battle of Bosworth, when Richard was killed. And he was sent to Richard's close friend in Yorkshire, who was an individual called Francis Lord Lovell. And then he was sent to Ireland with Lovell.
Wow. Okay, so how did their lives end, so far as you know?
As far as we know, in terms of the younger prince, it does look like he was the individual that was executed in Tyburn in London in 1499. And he was 26 at the time.
Why was he executed?
He had tried to invade Henry VII's kingdom 3 times in 1495, 1496 and 1497. And he was then captured by Henry VII. Henry VII said that he was just a French tourney boatman's son called Perkin Warbeck. And then he was executed as Perkin Warbeck. But again, we have to dig deep and look at all of the things that were happening at the time, because one of the interesting things was that his face was smashed in so that nobody could recognize him as being the son of Edward IV, because we have a drawing of him and he's the double of King Edward IV.
Wow.
And in terms of the elder prince, we know that he must have died sometime after 1488, but certainly he was politically dead by May 1491, because at that time his garter stall in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle was reallocated to the son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And there's only a very limited number are allowed to be members of the Garter, including the monarch. So you only would reallocate a Garter stall if someone was dead or he had given up his place. So that's all we know about Edward V at the moment.
All right, let's sort of think about where we land here. I guess with the Richard III case, with your first project, I mean, you find a literal body, like there it is. And this story, it's necessarily a little bit more speculative than that. We don't find the princes' bodies and confirm the age that they were at their deaths. I guess, like, are there still people in the field who take a different view here, who think that Richard killed them or that something else happened?
Yes, I think they are. I think a lot of them say, oh, but the princes, they were found and they're in an urn in Westminster Abbey.
Right. We're talking about the 2 child skeletons that were found in the Tower of London that we will have heard about at the beginning of the episode.
Yes, absolutely. And what I would say to that is, again, we've done the big deep dive into what we know about these remains in the urn in Westminster Abbey. And what we have concluded is there is no historical, archaeological, or scientific evidence for these being the remains of the princes in the tower. So I have called for these remains to be examined at our earliest convenience, i.e. tomorrow, if possible, because I want all of our modern sciences. We've got the DNA of the princes. We've got everything that we can put to these remains, because are they as big a myth as Richard's bones being thrown into the River Soar? Yes, they absolutely are. And we can see that from what we know about them.
Who do you think they were?
I think they were a foundation burial because they were found 10 feet down in the foundation of a building. And when you look at the archaeological level at the Tower of London, the level that they were found at was Iron Age, Saxon, Roman, or early Norman. And what these were burials of children put into the foundations of buildings because they believed with these burials, the buildings wouldn't fall down. And when you look at where these children were found, they were found right in an area where a Roman temple was located underneath the Tower of London.
I mean, it seems like one of the big complications you've been dealing with in all of your work is just this massive sense in so much of the historical literature that Richard III was a villain. Why is that such a persistent idea? Like, who did it serve to put that story out there? Yeah, and how did it really take hold?
I think it served the Tudors. I think Henry VII in particular was a very insecure and paranoid monarch. So I think for them to continue to make this story of Richard the evil monster, the tyrant, it then makes the Tudors and Henry VII, Henry VIII look like, the good choice, that they were the better monarch. And I think it simply comes down to the victors write the history. They write the story. And what the project has been really focusing on is 15th century documents, people who were there at the time, witnesses, things that are contemporaneous, rather than the later 16th century chroniclers who were writing about Richard. They weren't there and they weren't witnesses. So I think this is what I would say, going forward is the police methodology is important. It's really important for the study of history. We cannot, ignore lines of investigation because we might have a presumption about them or an attitude about them or want to close them off because we don't feel that they're important. We couldn't do any of that in this investigation. We had to look at everything. So I think, again, this is what I would say to the young historians, is use contemporary materials from those that knew people rather than what later writers said who weren't there.
Philippa Langley, thank you so much for coming on History This Week.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you.
Philippa Langley is a historian, an award-winning producer, and author of The Princes in the Tower, Solving History's Greatest Cold Case. History This Week is a Back Pocket Studios production in partnership with the History Channel. To stay updated on all things History This Week, sign up at historythisweekpodcast.com. And if you have any thoughts or questions, send us an email at historythisweek@history.com. This episode was produced by Corinne Wallace. It was sound designed by Ben Dickstein and also produced by me, Sally Helm. For Back Pocket Studios, our executive producer is Ben Dickstein. From the History Channel, our executive producers are Eli Lehrer and Liv Fiddler. Don't forget to follow, rate, and review History This Week wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next week.